Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 12 minutes before a gunman would turn his entire world upside down. St. Michael's ER in Philadelphia smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee under buzzing fluorescent lights that hum with the steady drone of institutional exhaustion. Katie Morrison stands at the medication cart on her first week, moving with the kind of precision that makes the chaos around her look choreographed. An elderly woman is admitted with chest pain on stretcher 3. A teenager with a laceration screams through the curtain divider. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm from the trauma bays. Katie does not look up. Her hands never shake during for insertions. Her suturing is textbook perfect, each stitch placed with the spacing of someone who has done this 10,000 times before. She speaks only when necessary. Her voice when she does speak is flat, deferential, designed to take up as little space as possible in a room full of louder people. A pair of worn combat boots sits in her locker, wrapped in protective plastic. She has not unwrapped them in 8 years. The boots themselves are scarred along the edges, the leather cracked in places where sand has worked its way through the stitching. The laces are still knotted from the last time they were tied. Katie has a faint limp favoring her left leg, barely noticeable to anyone not trained to observe human movement the way soldiers are trained. Her gait corrects itself automatically when she crosses the ER floor, but the limp returns the moment she thinks she is not being watched. Rope burn scars mark both forearms in parallel lines, visible when she reaches high to retrieve supplies from the shelves, scars that look like they came from something other than a hospital accident. Most of the nursing staff have already learned not to ask. Dr. Whitfield arrives at the nurse's station at 7:30 in the morning, his $12,000 Omega Seamaster catching the fluorescent light as he reviews the overnight charting. He is the ER director, a position that comes with an office on the 3rd floor and the kind of authority that makes people defer to his tone rather than his words. He has been running a billing scheme with integrated medical supply solutions for 4 years now, inflating supply orders by 40% and pocketing the difference through a shell corporation in Delaware. The numbers are substantial. Last year alone, he cleared $847,000 in unmarked deposits. This year he is on pace to double that. It is a careful operation. It requires precision. It requires people who do not ask questions. Katie Morrison asks questions. During morning rounds yesterday, she flagged 3 irregularities in the supply orders. 3. She did this by hand, using the old paper charting system nobody else bothers with anymore, cross-referencing the physical inventory against the billing document with the focused intensity of someone conducting an audit. She had no authority to do this. She had no mandate. She simply noticed that the volumes did not match and the costs did not align, and her hands moved to correct it before her brain caught up to what she was doing. Dr. Whitfield watched her flag those discrepancies and felt something shift in his chest, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a threat. The kind of threat that does not announce itself loudly but moves through systems like water finding cracks. He steps too close to her at the medication cart during morning rounds. Katie is reaching for a 500 milliliters bag of normal saline, the for tubing already primed and ready, and Dr. Whitfield positions himself so that she has to either acknowledge him or bump into him. She stops. She turns. She keeps her face an unreadable mask, the way people learn to do in certain professions, in certain places, in certain wars. Where did you train, Katie? His voice carries the warmth of someone asking about the weather. Your credentials came from University of Pittsburgh, but I am wondering if you did your residency somewhere more specialized. She does not blink. University of Pittsburgh, sir. Nursing track through their trauma program. Interesting. He smiles, but it is the kind of smile that does not reach his eyes. Most nurses fresh out of university struggle with our volume here. You seem to have a certain, tactical approach. Field experience, maybe. No, sir. Just attention to detail. He nods slowly and walks away, already planning. The math is simple. If she keeps asking questions about supply orders, if she keeps flagging discrepancies, if she starts comparing notes with the other nurses or brings her observations to the hospital administration, the entire operation collapses. The investigation takes maybe 60 days. The federal charges come in 90. His options narrow to two: find a way to discredit her, or find a way to remove her. He chooses discredit first. That afternoon, standing in the staff lounge with 3 nurses and the pharmacy director, Dr. Whitfield says he will give $50 to anyone who can guess how long Katie Morrison will last before she quits. The tone is light. The stakes seem trivial. Nobody catches the calculation underneath. He frames it as a friendly bet, the kind of banter that happens in hospital break rooms all the time. One of the nurses, Sandra, laughs and guesses 5 days. Another guesses 3. The pharmacy director does not guess but smiles in that way people do when they are witnessing a small cruelty and choosing not to interrupt it. Dr. Whitfield himself guesses 6 days. 7 at most. He opens a small notebook and writes down the date and time, Friday, September 13th, 3:36 p.m. He tears out the page and tapes it to the microwave. "Gentleman and lady," he says, "let us see who breaks first." The room does not laugh with him. But nobody contradicts him either. That night, Katie sits at her kitchen table with her daughter, Emma, who is 8 years old and drawing pictures of nurses with purple stethoscopes. Emma has no idea what her mother actually is. Emma thinks her mother works in a hospital because it is a job that helps people. Emma does not know that her mother spent 11 years in a place called Bagram where the electricity ran on diesel generators and the heat was so intense it made the air shimmer like water. Emma does not know that her mother once held a field hospital together alone for 11 hours while rockets fell around her and she kept breathing, kept moving, kept her hand steady enough to thread sutures through human flesh in conditions that would have broken someone with less training. Emma knows her mother has a limp and knows to ask what it was from and knows to stop asking when her mother's eyes go distant. That is all the truth a child needs. Katie braids Emma's hair and reads her a story and tucks her into bed and then sits alone in the darkness of the kitchen, her hand pressed against an old scar on her left thigh, pressing hard enough to feel the ridge of tissue underneath. She has been out of the field for 8 years. She has been erased from military records by people who do not exist. She has a new social security number and a new name on her nursing license and a daughter who will never know what her mother survived. St. Michael's is supposed to be the place where she disappears into normalcy. It is supposed to be the place where Katie Morrison, Master Chief Petty Officer, dies and someone else gets to live. But Dr. Whitfield has already started the clock. Friday morning arrives with the kind of humidity that makes everything in Philadelphia feel heavier. Katie arrives at St. Michael's at 6:45 a.m., 30 minutes early the way she arrives every day, moving through the corridors with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of black coffee. The ER is already staffed for the morning shift. The day team is hanging fours and reviewing overnight reports. The night team is finishing their last notes before handoff. Nobody has taken down the bet note from the microwave. It sits there, slightly curled at the edges, visible to everyone who reaches for their lunch or heats their coffee. 6 days, Sandra says to Katie as they pass in the hallway. That is my bet. You will make it to Thursday at least. Katie does not respond. Her jaw clenches slightly, just barely perceptible, just barely visible, but her voice stays flat and her eyes stay fixed on the medication cart in front of her. Thank you. Dr. Whitfield appears at the cafeteria at noon. Katie is sitting alone at a table in the corner, her tray in front of her containing a small salad, grilled chicken, and a roll. She eats the same thing every day. She leaves the same size tip. She throws away the trash in the same order, vegetables first, then protein, then the roll. She is methodical about everything. She is predictable in a way that makes her easy to target. Dr. Whitfield walks past her table. Then he stops. Then he turns back, and with the kind of casual motion that might look accidental to anyone not paying close attention, he knocks her tray to the floor. The plate shatters. The salad scatters. The chicken slides across the tile in a small trajectory of oil and grease. The sound is sharp and immediate, the crash of ceramic hitting floor, the scrape of cutlery, the sudden silence as 5 other people in the cafeteria stop eating and look up. Katie does not move for 2 full seconds. Her hands stay where they were, on the edge of the table. Her breathing stays even. Her eyes stay on the mess in front of her. When she does move, she moves without anger, without sadness, without any expression at all. She simply stands and retrieves a tray and a new plate from the cafeteria counter and holds it while a worker with a mop cleans the floor. She eats the replacement meal alone in the same corner, her spine straight, her face an unreadable mask. Clumsy, Dr. Whitfield calls out as he leaves. You should watch where you place your tray. She does not respond. But that was not the worst part. 2 hours later, during the evening shift change, Katie is working at the nurse's station reviewing a patient chart when Dr. Whitfield approaches her. He holds a file folder in his left hand. His right hand pulls the folder out and drops it on the floor at her feet with a deliberate gesture, letting it land face down in front of her, paper spilling slightly out of the open edge. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says. His voice is not loud. It is not angry. It is the voice of someone who is very sure of his power over the person in front of him. "I need that chart filed correctly." The nurse's station goes quiet. 6 nurses are within earshot. The pharmacy tech is 3 feet away, suddenly very interested in the medication drawers. A resident who was reviewing labs just found something incredibly urgent to do at the other end of the corridor. But they all heard it. They all heard the tone. They all heard the way Dr. Whitfield said it, the way he used the word sweetheart, the way he positioned himself to make sure everyone in a 10-foot radius understood the power dynamic at play. Katie looks down at the chart on the floor. She looks at it for exactly 3 seconds. Her jaw clenches once, a small tightening of the muscles at the back of her mandible, barely visible. Then her hands move. Her spine stays straight. Her face stays perfectly, impossibly still. She bends from the waist and retrieves the folder with steady hands. She does not rush. She does not shake. She does not speak. Her fingers take the scattered papers and organize them back into the file, and she walks to the records room and files the chart correctly in the system while every person at the nurse's station watches her go and then immediately looks away when she emerges. Dr. Whitfield is smiling when she returns. "Thank you," he says. "Excellent service." She does not respond. She does not meet his eyes. She returns to her work as if he does not exist, her hands moving across the medication cart, her attention focused entirely on the task in front of her, her breathing steady and controlled and not reflecting even a single molecule of what is happening underneath. This is what they trained her for, in a way. Not this specific humiliation, but the general principle, the ability to be broken in small ways and walk away still standing. The ability to absorb a blow and keep her hand steady enough to save a life. The ability to smile at nothing and mean it while everything inside her is moving with the precision of machinery that has learned to operate in places where mercy does not exist. That evening at 7:15 p.m., a young soldier is wheeled into the ER with a shrapnel wound to his right shoulder, a laceration approximately 4 inches long, bleeding controlled but requiring closure and careful examination for deeper tissue damage. His name is Corporal Aaron Hayes. He is 24 years old. He is an Army Ranger with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Platoon. He arrived at St. Michael's because his unit was doing a training rotation at Fort Dix, 47 miles away, and this is the closest Level 1 trauma center. The wound is painful but not life-threatening. The procedure is routine. The attending assigns Katie Morrison to assist. Corporal Hayes watches her as she prepares the field. She opens the sterile instruments with a specific rhythm, her movements efficient and economical, nothing wasted, nothing extraneous. She preps the wound with betadine solution in precise concentric circles, working from the center outward, a technique that is correct but also carries a certain signature to it, a signature that someone trained in field medicine recognizes immediately. She draws up 1% lidocaine for the local anesthesia and inserts the needle with the kind of steadiness that only comes from doing something thousands of times across years. Then she threads the first suture. This is where Corporal Hayes' entire body goes still. She is using a 4-0 nylon on a cutting needle, a standard choice for skin closure, but the way she is placing the stitches is not standard at all. The spacing is precise, exactly 3 mm between stitches, the knots tied using a specific tensioning method that leaves the skin edges perfectly approximated without blanching. The stitch pattern itself is something that exists in field medicine manuals, something that exists in combat medic training videos, something that you learn when your job is to close wounds in conditions where infection could mean amputation or death. It is not a stitch pattern that nurses from University of Pittsburgh use routinely. It is a stitch pattern that a certain type of person uses when they have had to keep soldiers alive in places with names like Sanjan Valley and Jolan District and Bagram Airfield. Katie places the third stitch. Corporal Hayes leans back slightly and whispers something so quietly that the attending does not hear it. Only Katie hears it. "You were a combat medic," he whispers. "I have seen that exact stitch pattern in field training videos. I know that stitch." Katie's hands do not pause. Her eyes do not shift. She does not acknowledge him with her voice or her expression. She simply continues the closure, placing the fourth stitch and the fifth, her movements carrying the kind of certainty that only comes from having done this before, in conditions significantly more difficult than a clean hospital room under overhead lighting with all the supplies you could possibly need. When she finishes, the wound is closed perfectly, the edges aligned, the healing prognosis good. She pulls off her gloves and disposes of them and walks away without meeting Corporal Hayes's eyes, leaving him sitting on the gurney with a small smile on his face and the certain knowledge that St. Michael's ER contained someone other than what she claims to be. The next 3 days moved like a ticking clock nobody could stop. Katie kept her head down on Tuesday morning, arriving at St. Michael's at 6:15, 30 minutes before her shift. The ER smelled like it always did, antiseptic and copper and the faint metallic tang of 4 bags already running in the trauma bay. She changed into fresh scrubs, clipped her badge to her chest, and moved through the fluorescent corridors with the kind of invisible efficiency that made people forget she was in the room. That was by design. Whitfield was already there, in the physician's lounge, speaking into his phone in a voice low enough to be private but loud enough to carry. Katie heard her name as she passed the doorway. She didn't stop walking. By Wednesday afternoon, the game had escalated. Whitfield cornered her at the nursing station in front of 4 residents and 2 medical students. He was holding the patient assignment sheet, the sacred document that determined who worked which beds, and his smile had teeth. "Morrison," he said, loud enough that every head in a 20-foot radius turned. "You'll be taking pediatric intake in the waiting room for the rest of your shift. Document vitals." "That's it." Katie looked at the assignment board. She'd been handling mixed trauma rotation. Now she was being demoted to vital signs on sick children. Every nurse in that station understood what it meant. This wasn't an assignment. It was public humiliation dressed as a work order. "Understood," Katie said, her voice level as still water. "Good girl," Whitfield replied, turning away with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just landed a clean punch. The waiting room was hot and loud and chaotic. A toddler with a fever screamed while her mother tried to keep her still. An 8-year-old with what looked like a dislocated shoulder sat rigid with pain. An infant's cry cut through the ambient noise like a surgical saw. Katie worked through the afternoon with the kind of focus that turned chaos into data. Temperature. Heart rate. Respiratory rate. Oxygen saturation. She documented everything with the precision of someone for whom accuracy wasn't negotiable. Parents began asking for her specifically. The waiting room nurses, the ones Whitfield had been publicly dismissing, started watching how she moved between patients, how she calmed a terrified 5-year-old with nothing but a steady hand and a calm voice. She didn't have a stethoscope draped around her neck like a status symbol. She didn't name-drop procedures or drop into the kind of medical jargon that made people feel stupid. She simply did the work. But that wasn't the worst part. Thursday morning, Whitfield issued a new protocol memo. All wound management procedures, anything beyond basic cleaning and bandaging, now required physician sign-off before initiation. Not consultation. Sign-off. Which meant Katie couldn't touch a laceration repair, couldn't prepare a patient for suturing, couldn't even set up an irrigation tray without Whitfield's explicit written approval. The memo went out to all nursing staff. The message was clear: don't trust Morrison's judgment. Katie read it once in the break room, her fingers steady as she turned the printed page, and then filed it in her scrub pocket without comment. 3 nurses around her exchanged glances. One of them, a veteran named Patricia who'd been at St. Michael's for 18 years, said quietly, "That's personal." "Yes," Katie agreed, her eyes already moving toward the door. "It is." By Friday morning, Whitfield had restricted her to the lowest acuity cases. Routine follow-ups. Patients with non-urgent complaints. Diabetic checks and medication reviews. It was the work that needed doing, the work that mattered, the work that nobody watched. And Katie did it the same way she'd done everything else, with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested she was performing open-heart surgery instead of checking blood glucose levels. She took her time. She documented thoroughly. She asked each patient questions about their pain levels, their medications, their understanding of their condition. An elderly man with type 2 diabetes came in for a routine 3-month follow-up, and Katie spent 40 minutes with him explaining why his A1C was trending upward, what foods were spiking his blood sugar, and why consistency with his metformin dosing mattered. When he left, he asked the receptionist if he could request her for his next appointment. The nursing staff noticed. The quiet kind of noticing that didn't make noise. Patricia caught her refilling the medication cart and said, just loud enough for Katie to hear, "He's scared of you." Katie didn't respond. She was already thinking about something else, about Corporal Hayes, about the way he'd looked at her hands during the wound closure. About the fact that someone had recognized something she'd spent 8 years trying to bury. On Friday at 2 in the afternoon, the doors of the ambulance bay burst open with the kind of urgency that meant everything changed. An unmarked black sedan pulled up instead of an ambulance, and 2 men in dark windbreakers, federal agents. Katie's training had taught her to spot them 30 seconds before they announced themselves, escorted a man on a wheeled gurney through the ambulance bay directly toward the surgical wing. No paperwork. No intake. No announcement. The man had a field dressing on his abdomen, already soaked through with blood, and his eyes were moving like he was counting exits. Witness protection. That much was obvious. Katie was checking the medication refrigerator when Whitfield emerged from his office, intercepted the agents in the hallway, and demanded information. "This is a hospital, not a safe house," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 30 years of not being told no. One of the agents showed him something, a badge, a credential, a federal order of some kind, and Whitfield's face went the color of bad salmon. He knew what this was. A witness. Testimony. Documentation that would become evidence. And if St. Michael's documented this case properly, if his billing codes and supply orders were suddenly examined, if auditors started asking questions about why his trauma cases had 5 times the normal per case medical supply expenses, everything would collapse. Katie saw him calculate it all in real time, saw the moment when his face hardened into something colder and more focused than anger. He wasn't panicked. Panic was for amateurs. He was already moving 3 steps ahead, already thinking about how to control the narrative, how to minimize exposure, how to ensure that if this witness case was documented, he wouldn't be the person holding the chart. She turned back to the medication refrigerator and closed it slowly, very slowly, giving herself a moment to think. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. The smell of bleach and iodine hung thick in the air. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor was beeping its continuous rhythm. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, except for the man in the surgical wing who'd been brought in through side channels with federal cover, and the doctor in the hallway who'd just realized his entire operation hung by a thread. What happened next would depend entirely on whether Whitfield could keep his hands off this case, or whether he'd make the mistake of trying to control it. Katie pulled her badge out and checked the time, 14:22. She had 12 minutes before her shift ended. Long enough to see what Whitfield would do next. Long enough to know, before the shooting started, exactly who she'd have to protect. The doors burst open at 2:27 p.m. Footsteps. Fast. Deliberate. Wrong. A man in a charcoal jacket, face obscured by a surgical mask, moved through the ER like he knew exactly where he was going. His right hand stayed in his pocket. His left gripped a folded newspaper nobody needed to read. The gesture meant something. The gesture meant threat. Katie was checking Corporal Hayes's dressing when the air pressure changed. Not gradually. All at once. She felt it before she heard it, that cold electromagnetic charge that precedes violence, the same sensation she'd learned to recognize in Bagram when Taliban scouts moved within firing distance. Her hand stilled on the bandage tape. The man's eye swept across the trauma bays. Searching. Finding. A nurse at the far station saw him first and stood, hand moving toward the call button, but Katie was already moving. No hesitation. No assessment of threat level or protocol review. Her body simply knew. The recognition was muscle memory, 18 years of recognizing hunters, and this man was hunting. She stepped directly into his line of sight and positioned herself between him and Corporal Hayes's bed. Not defensive. Not blocking with her arms crossed. Standing. Waiting. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, the kind that makes predators pause because they recognize another predator. Help you find something. Her voice stayed level. Conversational. A nurse assisting a visitor. The man's hand came out of his pocket. The first shot sounded like a woodpecker hitting a metal pole, sharp, too loud, wrong in the clinical silence of the ER. The bullet caught Katie in the left shoulder, spinning her half a turn, but her feet didn't move. She stayed between him and Hayes. Stayed standing. The second shot came faster. She felt the impact in her lower abdomen, left side, the round punching through muscle and tissue like a carpenter's nail through drywall. Her breath caught, but she didn't go down. Wouldn't go down. Hayes was still on that bed, still in his hospital gown, still exposed. The third shot hit her right thigh, high, close to the femoral artery. That one made her knees want to buckle, but she locked them in place, using the bed frame to stabilize. Blood was running down her leg inside her scrubs now, soaking her shoes, pooling on the tile floor in a dark expanding circle that smelled like copper and iron. She heard screaming. Multiple nurses now. The call button being hit again and again by someone's shaking finger. The man swung toward Hayes, a clear second, maybe less, and that's when security came through the trauma bay doors like they were born through them. Officer Brennan, 240 pounds, a former Marine, hit the shooter center mass, and both men went down in a tangle of limbs that ended with plastic zip ties around wrists and the man's face pressed against the floor. Katie's vision was narrowing at the edges. She could feel her heart rate climbing, not from fear but from blood loss, her body trying to compensate by pumping faster, working harder, dying faster. O2 sat dropping. Breathing becoming work instead of automatic. The fluorescent lights above her were too bright and then not bright enough. She lowered herself to the floor carefully, managing the descent like a controlled fall, and kept talking. Shoulder entry, rotator cuff area, through and through wound, no immediate arterial involvement, but I'll need imaging to rule out subclavian involvement. Her voice was steady. Clinical. Detached from the body it was coming from. Abdominal entry, left lower quadrant, possible splenic laceration, possible diaphragmatic injury depending on trajectory. I'm experiencing air hunger, so assume thoracic involvement. Thigh wound, femoral area but not femoral artery, I'd feel the pressure increase if it was severed. I'm still feeling pressure, so assume laceration of the vastus lateralis. Dr. Whitfield appeared above her, his face pale, his hands already reaching for a trauma shear to cut away her scrubs. For a moment his arrogance flickered, she saw the calculation in his eyes shift, the panic that comes when a crisis arrives that his money and connections can't handle. A first-year resident, Dr. Patel, knelt beside her, his hands visibly trembling as he looked at the 3 bleeding wounds. He was young enough that this might be his first real trauma, his first time seeing a person decide whether to live or die and choose life while bleeding on the floor. Katie reached out and grabbed his wrist. Gently. With the kind of grip that wasn't asking permission. Listen to me. You're going to apply direct pressure here. She guided his hand to the thigh wound. Firm. Sustained. Don't overcorrect. Pressure is information. Pain is data. Right now the wound is telling us there's blood loss but not catastrophic. Keep the data flowing by maintaining pressure exactly like this. I don't know if Dr. Patel's voice was shaking. You do know. Your hands know. Let them work. Katie's voice dropped to that register that people obeyed without understanding why they obeyed it. The same voice that had talked rangers through amputations in field tents. The same voice that had held people together when everything was falling apart. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Chen, was calling out orders. 2 units of O-negative hanging. Ultrasound being wheeled over. Katie's blood pressure was dropping, she could feel the numbers without seeing them. The cold creeping into her extremities. The tunnel vision starting. O2 sat 91, a nurse called out. 90, came the next count 30 seconds later. 88. Katie's breathing was shallow now. She could feel it. Pneumothorax developing, the air from the thoracic wound entering the pleural space, collapsing her left lung. Every breath was becoming a negotiation with her own body. You need to ultrasound my pericardium, she whispered to Dr. Chen. The abdominal wound trajectory, if the round passed through the diaphragm, fluid's been accumulating. Check for the echo-free space around the heart. Dr. Chen was already moving the ultrasound probe to her upper abdomen, watching the screen, and Katie saw his face change. The microsecond freeze that meant he was seeing something he didn't want to see. Fluid, he said quietly. Around the heart. Cardiac tamponade developing. Katie's vision was graying now. Her heart rate climbing, 142, 158, the numbers her body was screaming without words. The pressure building in her chest wasn't pain anymore. It was suffocation. Her own blood was drowning her from the inside. Subxiphoid approach, she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. 18-gauge needle. Aspirate slowly. You're looking for serous fluid, maybe blood. When the pressure releases, you'll feel the difference in venous return. Watch the blood pressure. When it starts climbing, you're done. Dr. Chen had already moved. Already had the needle. His hands weren't shaking because he understood now, Katie Morrison wasn't a dying patient. Katie Morrison was giving him a master class in how not to panic when everything is collapsing. The needle went in beneath her breastbone. The subxiphoid space. The emergency approach that took years to perfect, that most residents practiced on models before they ever did it on a human being. Dr. Chen did it in 19 seconds. The syringe filled with dark red fluid. Blood mixing with serous fluid. The sound of it filling was like the release of a pressure valve, and Katie felt her chest expand just enough to breathe again. Her oxygen sat climbing. 89, 91. 93. Get her to the OR, Dr. Chen said, and suddenly there were hands lifting her onto a stretcher, voices calling out blood types and antibiotic orders, the ceiling tiles blurring past as they moved through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Corporal Hayes was standing in the trauma bay when they wheeled her past. Still in his hospital gown. Still bleeding slightly from his own wound. His face was wet with tears, the kind that come without permission, without meaning, just the body's way of processing something the mind can't quite hold. You're going to be fine, Katie said as they passed him, and her voice was already fading, the anesthesia starting to take hold. You're going to be fine because I didn't teach you how to survive Bagram just so you could die in Philadelphia. Then the OR doors opened and she was gone, and everything went white and then nothing at all. In the trauma bay, Dr. Whitfield stood motionless, watching the space where Katie had been. His jaw was clenched. His hands were clenched. For the first time since he'd arrived at St. Michael's, the calculations in his mind were shifting away from profit margins and billing codes. They were shifting toward preservation. Within 6 hours, before Katie's surgery was even finished, Whitfield had made 3 phone calls. The first to board member Patricia Langford, who owed him for covering up her daughter's DUI from 3 years ago. The second to the University of Pittsburgh registrar, a woman he'd met at a medical conference, with a request to verify Katie's credentials and flag any inconsistencies. The third to Marcus Corletti, a compliance investigator he'd used before, a man who specialized in finding problems that didn't quite exist, in creating paper trails that looked official until the moment you looked close. He was building a narrative. Katie Morrison had violated protocol by not evacuating when the shooter appeared. She'd endangered herself unnecessarily. She'd put the hospital at liability. And her background, there was something off about her background. References that didn't quite line up. Military service that seemed incomplete. By midnight, the narrative was starting to take shape. By morning, it would be ready to weaponize. But Katie Morrison wasn't thinking about narratives or liability. She was in the operating room, her own blood being replaced by units of O-negative hanging from stands like red curtains, her own surgeon working by the light of focused lamps, her own damaged tissue being mapped and evaluated, and the decision being made, repair, not remove. And in a corner of a recovery room she wouldn't remember entering, she would wake to find an 8-year-old girl with her exact eyes and a stuffed rabbit tucked against her side, asking without words why her mother had come home in an ambulance. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Katie Morrison was simply fighting to stay alive in the place where people came to die, and winning, as she always had, with the kind of quiet that nobody noticed until it was too late. Recovery meant returning to a world she'd left behind. 2 days after surgery, Katie woke to the sound of a ventilator's rhythmic hiss, tubes running from her arms like tethers to a life she hadn't asked for. The shoulder wound burned with a pain that moved like electricity down her spine. The abdomen, that was worse. The thigh was manageable, almost abstract, like it belonged to someone else. She couldn't move. Didn't try. The ceiling tiles above her bed were the color of old teeth, and she counted them twice before opening her eyes fully to the 4 drip, the monitors, the careful absence of anyone waiting for her to wake. But Corporal Hayes was already there when clarity came. He sat in the plastic visitor's chair beside her bed on day 3, his left shoulder still wrapped but healing faster than anything Katie had done in the past 72 hours. A vase of flowers sat on the bedside table, daisies, which meant he hadn't known her at all before this, which made sense because officially, she was just a nurse. Officially, she was nobody. "Hey," he said when her eyes found his. "You're back." Katie couldn't speak with the endotracheal tube, so she didn't try. She blinked slowly, once, and his jaw loosened like that was all the permission he needed. "I've been here every day," Hayes said. His voice was careful, the tone of someone who'd spent time in recovery wards and knew that sound traveled differently through healing bodies. "They had to re-intubate you once. Day 1. But you came back. You always come back." He shifted in the chair, and it creaked under his weight. "The guy who shot you, they got him in custody. Witness protection thing all fell apart. Guys like that, they don't know when to quit." He looked at her bandaged shoulder. "You quit me. Saved my life and took 3 rounds doing it." Her eyes closed. Hayes didn't leave. By day 7, the endotracheal tube was gone, replaced with oxygen cannula, 2 prongs that breathed cold into her nostrils like an animal's whisper. She was moved to a regular room on the 4th floor, and Hayes came with her, carrying flowers that had begun to wilt, which somehow made them more honest than the fresh ones. Katie's voice came back thin and scratched, like something had broken in the mechanism. "You should go home," she said on day 9. It hurt to speak. "Probably," Hayes agreed. He was sitting in that same chair, a permanent fixture now, like the monitors. "But my brother Ryan would have waited longer. He waited 3 months for a medevac in Kandahar. So I can wait here as long as you need." Katie didn't ask about Ryan. She didn't need to. The way Hayes said his name carried all the history required. On day 10, the light came through the window in long medical rectangles, and that's when she heard the footsteps. Not the hurried pace of nurses, not the confident stride of doctors making rounds. These were official footsteps, two administrators and Dr. Whitfield standing behind them like a general ordering troops. Katie's body went completely still. Not from pain, not from fear. From recognition. The administrator was a man named Spencer, pale as hospital walls, carrying a folder that looked sealed. His voice was careful in the way that voices are careful when they're about to break something. Ms. Morrison, the board has completed its review of the incident from 2 weeks ago. Spencer opened the folder. The sound was louder than it should have been. After consulting with legal counsel and conducting interviews with staff present during the shooter incident, we've determined that your actions violated hospital safety protocol. Katie said nothing. She kept her breathing steady, kept her face an unreadable surface. Specifically, Spencer continued, you failed to evacuate the emergency department. Protocol requires all medical personnel to proceed to designated shelter zones during active shooter scenarios. Instead, you remained in the trauma bay and positioned yourself between the alleged shooter and your patient. She saved my life, Hayes said. His voice cut through the room like a blade, but nobody turned to acknowledge him. Whitfield stepped forward, arms crossed, his smile the smile of someone who'd already won before the game began. There's also the matter of your employment verification. The references you provided don't check out. University of Pittsburgh has no record of your clinical training under the supervisor you listed. Your background appears to be fabricated. Katie's eye shifted to Whitfield's face. He held her stare, expecting her to flinch, to cry, to break. She did none of those things. Her eyes were the color of flint, and just as hard. The board's decision, Spencer said, is to terminate your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings from your locker. Katie didn't move. That's not a request, Whitfield said softly. She sat up. It took longer than it should have. Every movement was a negotiation with flesh and bone, with the 3 holes that still didn't entirely believe they were part of a living body. Hayes moved to help her, but she raised one hand, a gesture so small it almost wasn't there. Stop. I can do this. The locker room was cold and fluorescent. A security guard she didn't recognize, young, uncomfortable, probably new, stood by the door while Katie opened her locker with the key they'd given her 2 weeks earlier, 2 weeks before she became a cautionary tale about what happened when you violated protocols by surviving. Inside, spare scrubs, a sweater from some charity 10K, and on the bottom shelf, the pair of worn army combat boots that Hayes had left on day 3 with a note that said only, from my brother. He'd want you to have these. Katie placed the boots in the cardboard box they'd given her. They went in carefully, like they were made of something more fragile than leather and memory. The walkout took longer than the walk-in had been. Her abdomen sent pain up through her ribs with every step, and her left leg wanted to drag, but she didn't pause. She didn't look at the staff who stopped in hallway to watch her go. She didn't look back. That evening, the house was too quiet. Too clean. Too full of the normal things that normal people did when they weren't bleeding out on ER floors or taking bullets meant for someone else. Katie stood in the doorway for 3 minutes before Mia appeared from the kitchen, marker still in hand from whatever she'd been drawing, her eyes moving from her mother's face to the cardboard box, back to her mother's face. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Mia asked. The question was so simple, so perfectly reasonable, that Katie couldn't find an answer. She tried to speak and found nothing, no words, no composure, nothing but a rope pulling tight around her chest. She set the box down and dropped to her knees, and Mia moved toward her instantly, 8 years of certainty that her mother's arms would still be there, would still hold her, would still be the safest place in the world. Katie held her daughter and stopped breathing normally. Her hand shook, not from pain, but from something deeper, something that had been waiting in the dark for permission to break. She pressed her face into Mia's hair and let the control slip for the first time since the first bullet hit. Later, after Mia was asleep and the dishes were cleared and the ordinary world had gone to bed, Katie placed the worn combat boots on the mantle. They stood there like a monument to something, to sacrifice, to brothers lost, to the cost of staying quiet when you should scream. She stared at them for 20 minutes without moving, her fists clenched so hard her nails drew crescent-shaped marks in her palms. The boots were a message, and she was just beginning to understand what it meant. Someone remembered. Someone had seen her. And someone was coming. The recovery room at St. Michael's smelled like antiseptic and rain. Katie sat in the trauma office reviewing charts when the admission came through: a construction accident, severe head trauma, a refugee patient named Rashid who'd been working illegally on a center city demolition site. She marked it down without thinking. Just another patient. Just another chart. 3 days later, during his follow-up neurological assessment, Rashid was sitting on the edge of the exam bed when Katie entered to check his pupils and motor response. She changed out of the surgical recovery ward into her new role now, her temporary credentials already processed, her return authorized by the hospital administrator himself. The wounds had knitted well. The muscle memory had returned. Her hands moved through the examination with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Rashid's eyes tracked her face as she approached with the penlight. She leaned in close, checking pupil reactivity, when his hand shot forward and gripped her wrist with surprising force for a man who'd spent 72 hours in a coma. His breath came shallow and fast. "You," he whispered. His English was fractured, each word pronounced separately like stones being placed. "You are Shadow. Bagram Angel of Death." The penlight went still in Katie's hand. Rashid's grip tightened, his eyes wide and fixed on hers with absolute certainty. "I see you. 11 hours in the field hospital. You hold line when 300 Taliban come. You save my brother. You save me." His voice cracked. "I know you. Everyone in Sanjin knows you. Shadow. That is what we call you." Katie stood perfectly motionless. Her breathing remained steady. Her face remained unreadable, the mask she had worn for 18 years, perfected across 3 continents and through operations that didn't officially exist. The veteran security guard, Marcus, 62 years old, retired Army Ranger, 23 years service, happened to be walking the corridor with his afternoon rounds. He heard Rashid's words through the open doorway. He heard the name. Shadow. He stopped walking. Marcus stepped into the room, took in the scene in exactly 2 seconds, and came to full attention. His hand rose in a salute so crisp it sounded like a rifle shot. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Morrison, son," he said, his voice filling the small exam room like a command echoing across a parade ground. "You're standing next to a legend." Word traveled through the hospital like electricity through copper wire. By lunch, the administrator knew. By 2 p.m., someone had made a call to a very specific number at the Pentagon. By 4:56 p.m., a 2-star general, General Marcus Harrigan, Joint Special Operations Command Liaison, stepped off a helicopter that landed in the parking lot and walked through the St. Michael's main entrance with Katie's entire declassified service record in a sealed folder under his arm. He found Katie in the trauma bay reviewing protocols with her new nursing team. The general was built like an armored personnel carrier, solid, gray at the temples, with eyes that had seen everything and decided to act anyway. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared, and everyone in the room understood without being told that something had shifted in the world. "Master Chief Morrison," he said. It wasn't a question. Katie turned, saw the rank on his shoulders, and nodded once. "Sir." "I need this room," he said to the nurses. It wasn't a request. It was a command. They left in seconds. The doors closed. The general opened the folder and began to read aloud, his voice steady and clear as a courthouse gavel. "Bronze Star. Purple Heart, first instance. Purple Heart, second instance. Purple Heart, third instance. Purple Heart, fourth instance." He paused between each medal, letting them settle into the air like stones into still water. Meritorious Service Medal. Joint Service Commendation Medal. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters. Navy Achievement Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Combat Action Ribbon. Joint Meritorious Unit Award. Navy unit commendation with 2 stars. At Bagram Airfield, Loga Province, September 2014, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison served as Senior Medical Officer for Forward Operating Base Shank. When Taliban forces launched a coordinated assault on the facility, 300 estimated combatants, she remained in the field hospital for 11 consecutive hours, performing emergency procedures on wounded, triaging 47 patients with only 1 corpsman and 1 military medic. 0 casualties attributable to medical causes. The general closed the folder. 17 commendations. For Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross you never accepted. He waited. Why didn't you accept it, Master Chief? Katie's jaw was tight enough to cut glass. The Navy Cross isn't about accepting, she said quietly. It's about doing the job. Everything else is just paperwork. The general almost smiled. He inclined his head slightly. Your brother-in-arms is waiting downstairs. Corporal Hayes. He has something to say. Corporal Hayes stood from his wheelchair in the hospital chapel, where the general had assembled everyone, the hospital administrator, nursing staff, security, administrative personnel. His left leg was still bandaged, still healing from the 3-bullet spread that Katie had treated while lying on the trauma bay floor, her own blood pooling around her back and shoulder. He'd been calling twice a day asking about his discharge papers, asking about getting back to his unit. He'd never asked about the woman who'd saved his life because some things you didn't ask. You just knew. He reached beside him and pulled out a pair of boots. Desert tan, scuffed across the toe, the kind of wear that came from walking through real sand, real combat, real consequences. He looked at Katie across the chapel and his voice didn't waver. These belong to my brother, Sergeant Robert Hayes, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. You saved his life at Bagram 6 years ago. He made me promise if I ever met you, I'd say thank you. Hayes's eyes were beginning to shine. Every time I thought about giving up after this, he gestured to his leg, I thought about what you did for my brother. How you held that line. How you didn't quit when it would have been easier. He extended the boots toward her. These belong with you now. Because you're the reason my brother got to come home. You're the reason he has kids. 2 kids. Emma and Jacob. He sends his love, Master Chief. He wanted to be here, but he's back at Lejeune. But I'm here. And I'm here to say what every ranger I know would say, thank you for coming home. The room fell absolutely silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the ventilation system humming through the hospital walls, where you could hear rain beginning to tap against the chapel windows. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. Then 20. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, pregnant, heavy with the weight of sacrifice and recognition and the simple human need to be seen by someone who understood what the cost actually was. Katie took the boots. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. Your brother, she said to Hayes, is the reason I did the job. All of you are. The general turned toward the back of the chapel where Dr. Whitfield had been standing, watching, his face shifting through colors like a mood ring run through a fever. Whitfield's mouth had gone white around the edges. His hands were already moving toward his phone, already calculating which board members might answer, which lawyers to call, which explanations might hold water now that a 2-star general had just walked into his hospital with declassified records of a subordinate nurse's actual service history. Dr. Whitfield, the general said, his voice dropping into a register that sounded like a tank idling in a garage. Your hospital credentials are hereby suspended pending federal investigation. 2 federal agents, FBI, marked by their windbreakers and the gravity of their movement, stepped forward from the crowd. One carried a folder identical to the general's. They'd been watching Whitfield for 9 months, they would later explain. 9 months of tracking inflated billing, fraudulent supply orders through a medical equipment company in which Whitfield held a silent 40% stake, kickback schemes worth $412,000 in overbilling. They had receipts. They had bank records. They had emails. This is ridiculous, Whitfield said, his voice cracking like old paint. I have board support. I have? The hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, stepped forward. She'd been reviewing Whitfield's files since noon, since the general had called her personally. She'd made calls to every board member. She'd reviewed the admission that morning, the federal witness patient, the one transferred in darkness, the one nobody was supposed to know about. She understood now what Whitfield had been trying to prevent. The board votes unanimously to terminate your employment and revoke your hospital privileges, effective immediately, she said, and her voice carried the weight of institutional authority. Security will escort you from the building. Local news cameras, the general had called them, had made sure they'd be there, captured every moment. Whitfield's face turning crimson. His hand shaking as security removed his ID badge from his lanyard. The camera flashes reflecting off his glasses as he was escorted past rows of staff and patients and families who suddenly understood that the meticulous doctor who'd always been so careful about policy had apparently been very, very careful about something else entirely. The footage aired that night on 3 stations. By morning, the state medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By evening, his wife had filed for separation and retained a divorce attorney. Within 72 hours, his name was trending on local news as a cautionary tale about corruption in healthcare, about ego masquerading as authority, about the cost of trying to break someone who'd already survived the unsurvivable. Katie, meanwhile, was offered the position of head of trauma nursing by Dr. Okonkwo personally, in writing, with an apology that took up half a page. She accepted, but only conditionally. Only if the hospital implemented a veteran hiring initiative for security and support staff. Only if they created a patient advocate program to prevent the kind of retaliation she'd experienced from happening again. The hospital agreed to everything. Corporal Hayes made calls that nobody formally organized but everybody understood. Calls to his battalion. Calls through veteran networks that stretched across Pennsylvania like roots through soil. Word spread through military channels the way fire spreads through dry grass. A master chief had been wronged. Then vindicated. Then honored. Hayes put out a single message, quiet and direct, passed hand to hand and phone to phone. If you can make it to Philly on Saturday, show up for shadow. Saturday morning arrived cool and clear. Katie dropped Mia off at her mother's house. Reconciliation there had come quickly once the truth emerged, once it became clear that Katie hadn't abandoned her family out of choice but had been forced out by a man with institutional power and no conscience. Katie kissed her daughter's forehead, promised her ice cream later, and drove to St. Michael's. She was planning a quiet day. Paperwork, introductions, maybe a review of the new protocols she'd spent the previous 48 hours developing. Instead, as she approached the hospital entrance, she saw them. 150 combat veterans in formation along the front walkway. Army Rangers in dress uniforms, Navy SEALs in fatigues, Marines in dress blues, Air Force pararescue in tactical gear. Some on crutches. Some in wheelchairs. Some with service dogs at their sides, sensing the magnitude of the moment. They stood at attention, and as Katie walked the path toward the entrance, they saluted in perfect unison, a wave of raised hands following her path like water closing behind a ship. Katie stopped walking. Her throat tightened. Her eyes filled. Not with shame this time. Not with isolation. With recognition. Corporal Hayes stepped forward in his wheelchair and rendered a salute so crisp it echoed across the parking lot. "Welcome home, Master Chief," he said. Inside, the hospital had unveiled a small bronze plaque in the emergency department, in honor of Master Chief Katie Morrison, courage under fire, service above self. That afternoon, Katie took Mia to get ice cream from the corner shop near Rittenhouse Park. They walked past a strip mall on the outskirts, and through a storefront window, Katie saw Dr. Whitfield. He was sitting at a folding table with a laminated banner propped behind him, supplemental insurance policies, affordable rates. His suit was wrinkled. His hair was graying faster. He looked up as they passed, their eyes meeting for exactly 1 second, and his gaze dropped immediately in shame. Katie didn't break stride. She kept walking, Mia's hand in hers, the worn combat boots now sitting in a place of honor on her mantle at home, next to a photograph of Sergeant Robert Hayes and his family, next to a letter from his children thanking the woman who'd brought their father home. That night, Katie tucked Mia into bed. Her daughter looked up at her with eyes full of questions finally answered. "Mommy," Mia asked quietly, "are you a hero?" Katie smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead, and her voice came soft and steady. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." She sat with her daughter until the breathing became deep and regular, until sleep came. Then she walked to her mantle and looked at those boots, worn leather, desert sand still in the creases, a brother's gratitude made physical. She thought about Bagram. She thought about the 11 hours. She thought about every choice that had led her here, to this moment, to this recognition, to this home. By the way, if you've watched this far, you know the truth about quiet people. The ones the world underestimates are often the ones holding it all together. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like Katie's. Leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value? And share this video with someone who needs to know that sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody thought to look twice at.